At the beginning of each part of a video series, I like to recap the previous part to remind students what they created. It really helps cement that information into your mind when you look at it again and see how far you've gotten. So in part 2, we start out with output. We created a bunch of scripts to output former list, Avery 5160 labels, those are the 10 by 30, and the envelopes. And if you click on these, you'll see and remind yourself what we did. The current is a very simple layout here that allowed us to print just the current information. Just really a header, body, and a footer. In fact, you really only need, at that point, I can see there's a spelling error here with John Mark Osborne. Let me fix that. That was probably in the record locking section. And if we come in over here to our list, it's just a found set. We can view that. Very simple layout. The scripts were really more complicated. Now with the Avery 5160s, we learned how to work with labels that crept up and down. We had to change the body size to fix that. Something you don't find in the manual, or the wizard doesn't help you with that because it never quite comes out right. Same with envelopes, they never quite come out right. You have to fiddle with them a little bit, so knowing how to work with them and work with your particular printer and how it feeds really helps out. Now we can go into our script workspace and do a search for print. Because we have good naming conventions, we can find all those scripts that print. There's the labels print, there's the envelope print, here's our phone list. Now you may not remember the phone list, but this is the one that put it into 3 columns. It was like one of those old-fashioned phone lists you pinned up on your cubicle back in the day. Then, of course, we had our contacts print, which is probably the longest one here. We had to isolate records when it was all this stuff we did. It was pretty complicated. Go to relayed record. It ended up being a pretty good script. Now, remind yourself about this layout. I'll go into our phone list layout. Go to the print section. We have nicely organized here. And there's our print phone. And you can see we had 3 columns. We had it organized by a sub-summary part by this calculation that grabbed the first letter of the last name. We had a tab leader. It had all kinds of cool stuff we put in here. Then, of course, over in companies, we also had some print scripts. We don't really need to go over theirs, but they do have some, there is a print PDF option here, some special stuff we did there. So that's pretty cool stuff. The next thing we did was we went over correspondence. One of my favorite things. You need to correspond with your contacts and keep track of that. So we made this whole correspondence interface. And what we did was we imitated Microsoft Word, its merge letter capability. And we had the ability to go ahead and choose a field and then insert it. And it mimicked that chevron. They're not really chevrons here, they're less than, greater than signs. But what we could do then is make letters and save them, of course. We had all kinds of letters saved in here. We used lookups, if you remember, not auto enters, because lookups worked better here. We can put a subject in here, we can print, we can email, we can go ahead and text message if we want to. Pretty cool little interface. We even had attachments that we worked with. So we could store those attachments and then go ahead and export them to a temporary folder and attach them to an email if we wanted to do that. Now if you remember, if we go into our managed database, what we ended up doing eventually, because we start off with a replace to turn this template into a letter. But what we end up eventually doing is coming in here and making it a calculation. So what we did was we looked for very exactly what our merge fields were and replaced them with the content. So that made a letter that was unique for each person, a form letter in a sense. But we put it in here eventually to figure out record locking, which we covered later. We let it stay as is with the replace, which caused record locking, but later on we went ahead and fixed it. We also had a history in here, and if you remember, whenever we run our scripts to print or to email, it would go ahead and run our history, which would keep track of whatever we did as far as corresponding with people. We kept track of everything inside this table, this history table, and then what we could do is see what happened over here in our history. And of course we can add in manual correspondence, such as what might happen with, let's say, a phone call or a meeting. Of course, if you did an email that wasn't utilized inside the program, you could add it there as well. So you can add in stuff automatically and manually into your correspondence history, and then really keep track of what you've talked to your customers about, because you can't remember every single one, right? Then we went into the most complicated chapter I think I've ever done in my video training ever. And that is the linked contacts. what it required was a join table between contacts and contacts. So it was really a self-join, but we need that join table because we need that extra record, those records to represent this connection. So there's a record representing the connection from Gil Amelio to John Mark Osborne. If we go over here and take a look at Gil, we'll see John Mark Osborne is over there. So to connect those, we made that join table between the two, which basically stored the foreign keys from both sides of the contacts. In other words, a primary key from John Mark Osborne and a primary key from Gil Amelio. Now what we eventually did was we made a solution that worked really well, but we had trouble getting there. And I did that on purpose because I wanted you to understand that nothing ever works perfectly when you're working in FileMaker. Sometimes you have to reverse out and go back and try a different way, especially with complicated techniques. You're like, I've never done this before, it may not work. So what we had originally, we had two portals on top of each other, and we realized that it wasn't going to work properly. And so then we made it one portal and used hide objects to hide the different versions of the fields. So if you look into Manage Database, we'll see in the relationship section that we actually have two paths here. They both look at one portal. This is one portal right here, but there's two sets of fields going two different directions, and we use hide objects to hide those. Then of course we had the dwindling list. As soon as we chose one from here, it would be removed from the list. You can see how Gil Amelio is not in there. And we also had that with our picker because we had, issues possibly with remote connections where it might be slow, and we found out that pickers can be a lot faster. Since that was such a long and complex chapter, we went into a pretty short one about record locking, but it's not any less important. We start off by showing you how to share files locally. If you remember that, we went into our sharing, into Share with FileMaker Clients, turned it on, got everything working, and then was able to connect to ourself and was able to see another copy of this database without putting it up on the server. And this allowed us to check record locking. We showed you how record locking is triggered. It's not by clicking into a field, it's actually by modifying. You have to actually go and modify it, and that's what actually goes ahead and gets that record locked. Then we showed you open record and commit record to open it with a script and commit it. We showed you how to test with set error capture, and we did all kinds of things. Again, we fixed the correspondence script because the replace would cause record locking, so we put it in a calculation. All kinds of important stuff that you need to remember when you're programming in a multi-user scenario. And then finally, we worked on documents. We made a single container field first up here and showed you how to do it manually. So if we went over here, you can see how we have our placeholder text, and it just tells you what to do and go to the menus. That's simple and easy and straightforward, but then we had our documents, and they were a little more complex. So we decided to script them. So we made scripts that would allow you to insert a document. Once you insert a document, then you could open it, or you could attach it to an email. There was all kinds of things you could do, and we showed you all those steps there. And then finally, at the end, we decided, well, we might want documents in several different tables, so we made it a universal table. So now we have a table with a few changes that supports documents in both companies and contacts. So you learned quite a bit, and I want to remind you about that and remember what you learned. In fact, some people go back and watch these videos again, and sometimes they watch them and then build them. It's really hard to learn all this stuff in just one go through the videos.